Which Crash Bandicoot game do you think has the most playable characters? It's one of the racing games, surely. Or could it be Crash Team Rumble? I don't know, I never really played that one. Is it one of the Titans games? Do the Titans qualify? We all know there's only one game that lets you run around as the best character in the franchise. Or is there? Whatever the case may be, it is of course the Sane Trilogy that I'm going to be talking about today. And yes, this is just a remake of the first 3 PS1 games, which only ever let you play as Crash or his sister Coco. But by my count, the Sane Trilogy actually has somewhere around 80 more playable characters than the originals did. Sort of. So let's explore how that can possibly be possible and see what other fun facts and crazy tangents I find an excuse to talk about as we do. Officially, it is just Crash and Coco who you're able to play as in this game, same as on PS1. The only real difference here is that for most levels, you're now allowed to choose between the two of them, rather than Coco being restricted to just a few Crash 3 levels, as she was originally. And actually, it's the levels that don't give you that choice that are sort of the key to doing things like, as an example, playing as Komodo Joe instead. Because there are still some places where you're not allowed to play as Coco, like most of the boss fights. And usually, with the levels where you're riding on an animal, you have to play as the character who featured in the PS1 versions of those levels. Same for some of the vehicle stuff too. The way that that's all handled is pretty simple. Every level has something called a zone info file, which is needed for things like displaying the name of the level and whether it's treated as a Crash 1, 2 or 3 level. And in the cases where you're supposed to be playing as one particular character, their name will be listed in the zone info file too. So for something like, let's say, the Crash 2 level, Bear Down, the name Crash is in that file because you're only supposed to be allowed to play as Crash here. If you remove his name, either Crash or Coco is allowed in here now. Or if you change it to say Coco instead of Crash, it becomes a Coco exclusive level, even if you haven't unlocked her yet. Same for any level that's normally open to either character. You add someone's name into the zone info file, and that will be the character you always play as there. I don't think it's that interesting to play as Coco in Crash levels, or vice versa. Their gameplay is more or less identical anyway, so all that's really different is the occasional freaky missing animation, and that's about it. But Crash and Coco's names aren't the only ones that you can add into those files. I have, in the past, talked about there being some secret playable characters in this game. Namely, the Skylanders Imaginators version of Crash is still possibly my favourite ever design of the character, by the way, as well as a few other prototype Skylander-related creatures, generally presumed to be some leftovers from some cancelled Skylanders project or just cut content from a Skylanders game, who may or may not have at some point been used for testing stuff in this game. This guy we definitely have seen evidence of having been used for that. And all it takes to spawn into a level as one of these characters is writing their name into that level's zone info file. Because even though the game doesn't ever present them to you as options that you can play as, they still have all the necessary files in the right places to make that work. And like I said, I have covered these guys before, so I won't go over all their abilities and stuff again now, but I do have a significantly better understanding of the game and the file formats now than I did when I first discovered the existence of these characters. So I'll just mention a couple of new things that I figured out in the 6 years since I first made a video about them. Firstly, you can make them playable in any level, anywhere in the game, rather than it only being possible with levels that have a certain number of letters in their name, obviously. And secondly, this one took me far too long to realise, but they are in fact able to jump. And it's not complicated to enable that. Every proper playable character in this game, as in everyone you can access simply by adding their name into a level file like all of these, they all have what's called a character data file. There's all sorts of important crap in there, including the code that controls how a character jumps. Jump height, jump distance, etc. And in the case of all of these Skylanders characters, they all have that code in their character data files, and it's just that it's been turned off. You literally just need to change a 0 to a 1, and they are able to jump again. Years it took me to notice that that's what the issue was. Sadly though, even with that fixed, all the other problems that these characters had are still there. For example, their total invulnerability to any hazards, which sounds like a useful thing until you find yourself stuck at the bottom of a pit for all eternity because it doesn't actually kill you. Now, you might be aware of a Skylanders Crash mod that I released a few years ago, and he was able to take damage and do most of the things you should be able to do in this game. And this is an important distinction to make. That particular mod, as well as my playable Cortex mod and things like that, those kind of mods are just model swaps. You're still playing as normal Sane Trilogy Crash when you use those. They're just reskins. Not really any different to swapping Crash's normal model with his jetpack skin or the electrocuted skeleton skin or whatever. This is playing as Crash but made to look like Cortex. This is the player character actually changed to be Cortex. But we'll get to that. The important things to keep in mind when we're thinking about playable characters are those character data files that I mentioned, and the fact that I keep talking about Skylanders. I am going to be saying the word Skylanders a lot throughout this discussion. Now, it isn't just jumping that's handled by the character data files. Take normal, standard Sane Trilogy Crash. His file includes properties like how fast he runs when he's invincible, the position and angle that he sits at when riding various vehicles and animals, all the different hitboxes he switches between depending on what he's doing at the time. And yes, because people ask me this a lot, you can change the pill-shaped hitbox that everyone hates to a box-shaped hitbox. But it's not the simple catch-all solution that you'd be hoping for. Yes, it maybe makes certain parts of the game easier, but the engine and all of the level design was not constructed with that in mind. Everything is based around you having a pill-shaped hitbox. And if you do change it, you're going to start to struggle with walking up hills, and any tiny little ridge on the ground becomes an obstacle you have to jump over. Lots of other things break if you do change it, but the character data file is where all the data for that is, if you want to break it. Also in that file is the mask object that Crash wears when he's invincible, and the different variations that follow him around when he's not. Even the drop shadow that's always visible beneath Crash, designed to help you land in the right spot. That's something that's separate to the shadows created by the level lighting. That's part of his character data file. Unless we're talking about the Crash 1 bridge levels, where there is an actual drop shadow object that physically exists in the level, totally independent of the player, that's just set to always follow you at a fixed vertical position, which is why it's still visible even when there's nothing below you. That's an interesting object to swap into other things. This is my preferred way of making these levels easier, rather than destroying the whole collision system of the game by messing with hitboxes. The point is, a lot of what makes Crash Crash is in his character data file, including, well, Crash himself, the actual Bandicoot. The 3D avatar that appears in the level, that moves around depending on what buttons you press, that Crash Bandicoot object, as with every other playable character, is a type of entity called a C actor, stored inside the character data file, in exactly the same way that every object that's part of a level is stored within the map files. In fact, C actors do appear as objects in levels sometimes. In every boss fight for a start, the bosses are always C actors. Crash and Coco's animal friends too. Most of the vehicles, even some enemies, the more complicated ones usually, like the spitting plants that aim their projectiles towards you as you run around. More simple enemies and basic NPCs and stuff like fake Crash are a different kind of entity. The same thing that's used for crates, moving platforms and collectibles, but more complex things. Another example would be the mummies from the Egyptian levels that to begin with are inside a sarcophagus, and then their behavior changes once you break them out. Generally, anything like that will be one of these actor objects. So what exactly are the implications of all of the playable character objects being in the same format as certain other characters who've just been placed into levels? Well, essentially, it means that character files and map files are the same thing, just labeled differently. That's why you can do things like change the projectile produced by the bazooka into any object that's part of a level. The normal ammo is attached to Crash or Coco's files alongside the bazooka itself, but it's all totally interchangeable. To demonstrate that, here I am playing as Crash in a level where I've also loaded in Crash's character data file as if it's a map file. This isn't something else model swapped to look like Crash. This is another copy of proper Crash as an NPC, along with the different versions of Aku Aku masks that are also stored in his file. You can't interact with him much, just nudge him around a little bit, but if you die while you have an extra crash in the level, you'll lose 2 lives instead of 1 because it kills both of you. And you can't kill him directly, but he can hurt you. As part of Crash's idle animations, he sometimes gets out a yo-yo, and occasionally, while he's playing with it, he'll get caught up in the string and then he'll spin around to free himself. If you've ever had that happen while you've been standing next to a crate, you'll have seen that that is a real spin attack that does break anything around it, even though you didn't tell him to do that. And if an NPC Crash plays that animation while you as the player is standing next to him, that can hurt you. That whole yo-yo sequence and its variations, by the way, that's the same in-game event as when Coco gets her phone out and sometimes it explodes. So an exploding phone from an NPC Coco will also kill you. That's a real explosion, as I've demonstrated before. That'd be a handy ability to be able to just trigger whenever you want, instead of always having to wait around for ages hoping it will happen, wouldn't it? There are actually a few ways that the game can sort of give you an ability you aren't supposed to have that you can't trigger manually anytime you want, that are similar to what happens with the exploding phone. One that you might have noticed while playing is that when you fall down a significant distance, you'll hit the ground with the same animation that's used when you body slam, except it actually is just a body slam. If you manage to land on something destructible after falling far enough, you will smash through it as if you've body slammed onto it. That even happens if you fall onto reinforced crates in a Crash 1 level, where body slamming isn't something you can do in that game under any other circumstances, and where those types of crates don't normally exist. I kind of like that as a concept for level design, having crates you can only break by climbing up really high and falling back down onto them. I think that's fun. So that's something you might see happening in a few levels across the trilogy, but there's one specific location that uses a very different kind of fake body slam to give a similar effect. In this zigzag ice sliding section of the infamous Crash 2 level, Cold Hard Crash, if you just fall or jump off the end of the final slope here, you'll just land on top of this stack of crates and start bouncing on them. Or you can choose to activate a body slam after jumping to smash down through all of them at once. That's how this ability normally works, but if you slide, using the slide button while you're still on the ice just before you fall down here, you'll automatically transition into a body slam without needing to jump first. That isn't how the game works anywhere else, ever. Normally, you have to jump, or at least bounce off something before you can do a body slam, with the only exception being those times when you fall down a very long way. That isn't what's happening here. This drop isn't far enough to trigger that. Instead, there is an invisible trigger zone right around here that temporarily grants you a new, unique ability that you can only use once and only here. The first time you do a slide while you're within this trigger zone, you will actually slide and body slam at the same time. It's probably easier to see what's going on there if you move the trigger somewhere else and make it a bit bigger. In doing that, you can see that it also automatically moves the player to the exact center of the trigger to ensure you're always in the right spot when the body slam starts to let you break all of these crates. And in fact, it isn't specifically sliding that activates the body slam here. It's simply pressing the slide button that does it. That's R1 or circle on a PlayStation controller, which are the only controller buttons I understand. Sorry. But that means it will also happen just by crouching or just pressing that button anytime. Even backing out of the pause menu by pressing circle is enough. And this gives you the ability to body slam from a double jump, which isn't normally allowed. Hanging from monkey bars too. Lots of places you can body slam with this that completely go against how it's supposed to work. If you have the supercharged body slam unlocked, that upgrade does apply to this move too. It even works if that trigger is put into a Crash 1 level. You can't normally slide or crouch or body slam in that game. The button to do that isn't mapped to anything, but it still works anyway. And I mentioned controller buttons because as far as I can tell, it doesn't work when using a mouse and keyboard. I mean, I've never had it work on any computer I've tried it on, so I can't help but wonder if maybe when this game was ported to PC a year after its original release, the team doing that might not have been aware of this really obscure, fleeting change to the player's moveset that happens once ever across almost 100 levels, and so they just didn't take it into account when assigning the PC controls. Please let me know if it can be done without a controller, otherwise I'm going to keep thinking it is an oversight. I think if you play the PS1 version, you can understand why they wanted it to work like this, because you can sort of do the same thing there, except instead of a body slam, you're still sliding when you fall down through the crates. It's a bit weird in both versions, actually. I do think the body slam makes more sense visually. There's another fun thing about this though. Of course, it is possible to exploit it and modify this trigger object to change the ability that it gives you, and to disable the parts of the code that drag you over to its central coordinates and only let you use that ability once. So you can use the slide slam hybrid move everywhere if you want to. You can use it to give yourself the body slam in Crash 1 while keeping everything else as Crash 1's control scheme. It almost feels the same as a real body slam. Or you can do something like use it to get the bazooka out, even when you're not playing in Crash 3 mode, or in other places where that's not supposed to work. This is different to the more hacky method of using the bazooka on the jet ski that I've shown before, but even though this keeps the targeting reticle and the laser sight, the projectiles still ignore where you're aiming and home in on the nearest destructible object automatically. This weird gimmick is so overpowered and just overrides so many rules about how the game works that you can even use it to die while you're supposed to be invincible. You want to be able to press a button anywhere, anytime to make this happen? That's an option. Or what about this? You can use the weird body slam trigger thing to play Coco's exploding phone attack whenever and wherever you want, which makes experimenting with it to see if it might be useful anywhere a lot less time consuming. There's actually a lot of invisible trigger zones like that, where your movement is affected somehow, that I'd never thought about before I got into modding this game. Like anytime you're on some kind of conveyor belt, that's a totally static object that's as much a part of the scenery as the walls behind it. It just looks like it's moving because its model is animated. The thing that moves the player when you're standing on it is one of those invisible trigger zones. It's been configured to move you at a speed that matches how the conveyor belt model looks, but there's no connection between the model and the gameplay. Place that trigger area anywhere and it will do the same thing. There's another type of these secret movement modifying areas basically anywhere in the trilogy where you're climbing up any kind of steps. It's a very subtle temporary change to how your character controls. This is more about anti-frustration than aesthetics though. In the very first level of the whole trilogy, there's an invisible trigger zone right here around this whole area of the steps that boosts your jumping a little bit. It doesn't affect the actual height of the jump, rather it simulates you holding the jump button for longer than you really did. Even the lightest, briefest tap of the jump button here gives you quite a big jump, rather than the small hop you'd normally get from a short, sharp press. It's almost imperceptible if you're not looking for it. But try it here, and if you know this game, you will notice it. I assume that, at least in this instance, this was done to make it less likely that new players and/or gaming journalists would rage quit on the very first level by not knowing to hold the button longer to jump higher. Without the jump assistance in place, you would need to be holding the button down to make it up to the top of this. This game did come out the same year as Cuphead. That's all I'm saying. And that jump boost seems to work even for the Skylanders gang, now that I know they can jump in the first place. Doesn't seem to make much difference for Baby T, though, but his jump is already pretty impressive. It doesn't really matter that he doesn't die when he falls into a pit, because he can usually escape it pretty easily anyway. But, yes. Who or what is a Baby T? He isn't a Skylander, right? Well, Baby T is the little baby dinosaur, a tiny triceratops, perhaps, that you meet a couple of times in Crash 3. He lets you ride around on his back, he acts as an extra hit point, and he lets you jump further than you normally can. And just like all of those boss characters, the plants, the mummies, everything I mentioned earlier, he is the same kind of object as the proper playable characters. And because character files and level files are the same thing, it is possible to make Baby T and all of those other friends and foes playable to varying degrees. Baby T is a good one to look at first, just because he's one of the most playable of all of the playable characters that aren't supposed to be playable characters. He can run around, he can jump, he controls exactly the same as when you're sitting on his back, except he can't take any damage. So how does this work? Well, you can't just write his name into a zone info file like you can if you want to play as this guy. I mean, that is the way to make him playable, but there's a few more steps to it this time. Let's have a look at what basically happens when you load up a level that has a character's name in its zone info file. How about one of the levels that is normally restricted just to Crash? So, when the game looks in the zone info file for this level and sees the character name Crash, what it's ultimately going to spawn in as the player character is the C actor object that's called Crash Character, which is contained inside the file called Crash Character Data, which itself is in the archive called Crash. So that's the sort of route that the game takes to finding him. Archive, then data file, then character. If you change the character name in the zone info to Ride T-Rex, which is what Baby T's actor object is called, then if the game can find the character object called Ride T-Rex character, that's what it will spawn in as the player. But to get there, it's going to start by looking for an archive called Ride T-Rex, which doesn't exist. So you just get an infinite loading screen. All of those other characters, Crash, Coco, Blaster Tech, and everyone else, do each have their own archives with their own character data files, but none of these characters that are part of a level do. There's no archive just for Baby T. Instead, he's stored in the files of the levels he normally appears in. So, if you just make a copy of the archive for the level Dynamite and rename that to Ride T-Rex.pack, the game can then find that archive and look inside it. At that point, what it's looking for is the file called Ride T-Rex Character Data, where it expects that character to be stored. And no character that lives exclusively inside a map file has a character data file of their own, but as we've seen, character data files can be loaded into levels as map files, and so the reverse of that also works. Map files can be loaded in as character data files. Baby T's character object is stored inside the main map file for that level that also contains stuff like the spawn point, the intro cutscene, the time trial stopwatch, and other bits and bobs. So comparing what we have for Baby T here against how Crash is loaded in, the only difference now is the name of the file that contains Baby T. If you rename that to Ride T-Rex Character Data, that completes the chain. The game is perfectly happy to accept Ride T-Rex as a valid playable character now. The level will load and, oh, you'll be playing as an egg. Okay, before we worry about that, I do just want to say, I think it's really cool that the system works like this. It literally is just about having files named in the correct way, following this pattern, and the game will spawn you in as any character that exists in the right format. There is like a global character list file somewhere that mentions everyone who is playable as standard, but you don't need to add to it to make someone new work. You don't need to mess with any other files, anything in the executable, or anything like that. As long as all the files are named correctly and in the expected location, it's all done entirely through that zone info file. It does make sense that it works like this, I think, when you consider how this game was made, because the Sane Trilogy was developed by Vicarious Visions, rest in peace, using the Alchemy engine, rest in peace. And many of the Skylanders games also used Alchemy, including Imaginators, the only one I've played properly because it featured Crash Bandicoot. So that's why there is some evidence of stuff from those games still left in the files of the Sane Trilogy. Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled was built with Alchemy too, so you can still find fragments of the Sane Trilogy in the foundations of that game, more than just all of the reused props and so on. And what do the Skylanders games and CTR Nitro Fueled have in common? Apart from Spyro the Dragon, I mean. All of those games have a lot of playable characters. Like, a lot. I don't know my Skylanders history too well, but I was there for the whole lifespan of Nitro Fueled. They were adding new characters to that game every month for quite a while. And here's another Alchemy game that was also Vicarious Visions, Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2. Again, tons of unlockable playable characters that you can swap in and out and swap between mid-level and upgrade individually. This is a game I've always known about because it was pretty instrumental in getting NST modding off the ground in the first place, but I'd never played it myself until now. I'd never realised how similar it actually is to Skylanders in terms of gameplay.
Yes, it is I, Embryo!
And this one may not be totally relevant because this was so long ago now, and its version of Alchemy is unrecognisably different to these other games I'm talking about. But Crash Nitro Kart was Alchemy, another racing game with a fair few characters. By the way, just because someone's going to ask this if I don't say anything, no, Crash Bandicoot 4 is not the same engine as any of these games. I've seen this misconception everywhere. It's not Alchemy, it's not built from the remakes in any way, it's Unreal. That's why when you start the game it says it's Unreal. Please don't ask me if you can play as Louise in Crash Bandicoot 4. I don't know, but I hope so. That would be fun. But yes, the Sane Trilogy is an Alchemy game, and it may in fact be a bit of an anomaly in that it only lets you choose between two characters, usually. But clearly having support for a lot of playable characters is often an important factor for Alchemy games, and so that's my guess for why new ones can just be slotted in so easily. I mean, doing things like renaming archives is a bit more involved than how I've presented it here, but it still all just comes down to renaming a few other files, and that's all you ever need to do. No code needs changing, no files need replacing, nothing like that. Well, for Baby T specifically, there is still one final obstacle, that being the shell of his egg. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong egg. Here he is. When you first find the rideable version of Baby T in normal gameplay, he hasn't actually hatched yet. So probably the reason why he helps you instead of eating you is because he believes you're his mother.
Mother?
You need to bump into the egg to set him free, and then you can jump on his back. But when you are Baby T, there's no one else around to let you out. I did try things like dropping a Crash NPC onto the player to replicate the way it's supposed to work, but that doesn't do anything. I think the simplest way to solve this is just changing the animation that plays when you spawn into the level. I changed it to an animation where the character I want to play as is not trapped inside an egg. Alternatively, the cold hard Crash magical sliding slam thing can be used with any character to activate any of their behaviours, so you can hatch him by pressing a button instead. And here he is. You'll remember I mentioned that there was other stuff contained in the map file from Dynamite that I'm using to spawn him in. Ordinarily, if you were to load that file into another level without making any other changes, all of that stuff would be copied across too. But in this case, only the character named in the zone info gets spawned in when the level is loaded in this way. That's why you don't always see all of those masks that are part of Crash's file when you play as him until they're needed. And okay, as a thing that can be placed into any level anyway, who controls identically to how he does when you do that, maybe not that exciting, but I don't know, I think this is a lot of fun. I love Baby T, and he is more functional than most of these extra secret characters are. As long as you don't bring him into one of the levels where he normally appears, and then find and hatch and ride another copy of him up to the point where you're supposed to leave him behind. If you do that, the game will also try to leave you behind. That is a soft lock, I think. But Baby T isn't the only rideable animal, so how well do the others work? Less well, I'm afraid. The main problem with the Hog and Polar and Purah is that in normal gameplay, they automatically run through the level following a set path without stopping until the end. Baby T was always meant to be free roaming. You can even jump off him and back onto him again whenever you want, when he isn't the player character. So I think he's the only one of this group who does really work as a player character, unfortunately. Famously, I'm a big fan of Polar. Actually, here's something that only happens with Polar normally. In the level Unbearable, where you're riding Polar while being chased by a much bigger and scarier polar bear, that's the only time you're riding one of these auto-scroller animals towards the camera. rather than away from it. So here, his control scheme is actually reversed. In almost any other situation, your movement controls are always kept relative to the camera angle. You press left and you move towards the left of the screen. But for these animals that are restricted to their fixed paths, they move left and right relative to that path. So you may not even notice that this is a mirrored version of Polar unless you swing the camera around to be behind him, but it is. And because this isn't how movement works just for normal Crash gameplay, that kind of change wasn't necessary for his on-foot chases. But the very first boulder chase level does include an unused map file that contains trigger objects that change the direction you move in. It rotates everything around by 90 degrees rather than 180. Maybe it's something they added in just in case they did need it, but realized they didn't before it was ever set up properly. Those Crash 1 boulder levels are weird. They're built fully in reverse, as in, you're moving in the same direction you would in a normal level, it's just that the camera's been flipped around. Later chase levels are built so the camera is facing the direction it normally would, and you just start at the back of the level and work your way towards the front, essentially, which is much less confusing to work with. But hey, animals aren't the only special methods of transport in this game. The vehicles usually serve a similar function, so do they work any differently? Sometimes. There are some, like the jet boards in the Crash 2 river levels, which are objects placed into the level at certain locations that you mount when you jump on them. Basically the same as the animals. Crash's motorbike is another one that's part of the level, but not exactly the same because you spawn in already on the bike. If you place the bike object into a level and approach it, you won't mount it like you do with the board. It just kills you as soon as you touch it. And yes, it is tiny. That's how big it is when you're riding it too. The bike levels shrink Crash down to 60% of his normal size for some reason. If you've ever parked up next to fake Crash and wondered why he seems so huge, well, he's normal size, and the size that Crash is everywhere else. In the jet ski levels, Coco is at 70% scale, but the jet ski is in a whole other category of vehicle. Let's stick with these for now. The jet board is one of the vehicles that's simplest to use in places where you shouldn't be able to, because of the free movement that it gives you, like with Baby T. It was only intended to be used on these rivers, but the water there is all an illusion. In reality, the board only works on solid ground. That's what the water in all these rivers is, solid ground that has a very thin death plane that triggers the drowning animation just above the surface. That becomes more obvious if you play as a character that can't die, or if you visit this massive open area in Hang 8 where they didn't bother to add in the death layer because it isn't supposed to be accessible. You can't even see any of this normally, so who knows why it exists. Overcompensating for that mistake they made with some of the earlier river levels where you can see the edge of the terrain model, maybe? There aren't actually too many hidden areas like this across the Sane Trilogy that are actually traversable anyway. There is stuff like the part of the Crash 2 intro level that continues beyond the point where you teleport away, but that seems to just be copied from the PS1 version anyway. There's these level ending rooms in all the Crash 1 levels where you're rewarded with the gems. Every level just includes that area somewhere far from the main path. And it is all physically there. And anytime you see the game over screen, Uka Uka isn't in an endless void there. He's in a small room that's just painted black and is kept hidden until you get a game over. That room is the same model as the gem room, by the way, just textured differently. And yes, Uka Uka is playable, if you were wondering. Bonus levels too are always part of the same map as everything else in a level. That's obvious in situations where the camera follows you as you travel over to them, but even in Crash 1, when you get a loading screen before the bonus round appears, that is still part of the main level. The loading screen you see there is completely artificial, actually. There's a bit of code that displays it for a totally arbitrary amount of time, and disabling that doesn't break anything. If this is supposed to make it feel closer to the PS1 games, it seems like a strange choice to keep this over some of the stuff they went to the trouble of adding to this game that was never used in the end. Like, there's quite a few pieces of evidence of there having been a title screen closer to the original Crash 1 menu at some point. And in those Crash 1 gem rooms I just mentioned, in the old game, before you're given a new gem, you're treated to a procession of all all the gems you've already collected. That doesn't happen in the remake, but there is an unused spline in this room, the kind of invisible path that moving enemies and platforms and stuff follow. It's called Gem Spline, and this is the way that those gems would move if they were present, so it seems like that was planned or implemented at some stage. And also, every boss level in the trilogy, and only the boss levels, has the option to always spawn you in with some masks, like Crash 1 did, but it's been switched off. That's handled by the same part of the level data that makes masks in the Crash 1 dark levels work differently, illuminating the area around you in addition to giving you an extra hit point. And the Firefly levels in Crash 2 and 3 have that same Aku Aku configuration as their Crash 1 counterparts. The only reason why you don't get the glowing Aku masks there is because that only happens when the game is in Crash 1 mode. So it looks like they probably did use those special masks in these levels during development before the Firefly mechanics were sorted out. Makes sense. Back on the subject of characters though, that Crash 2 intro level that I mentioned does include an NPC version of Coco. That Coco can be made playable, but there's not much point in doing that really. She always just stays there sitting on the floor. There are some more functional alternative playable Cocos dotted about though. When you see her in one of the hub levels, those Cocos are a little different. If you replace normal Coco with one of the NPC Warp Room Cocos, she can no longer slide or body slam, unless, you know, you force that somehow. This does make me wonder if this is like an old version of Coco, from before it was decided to make her available everywhere, maybe. Similar to how in the PS1 trilogy, the only time you can walk around as Coco is at the very start of the China levels, so she doesn't need all the abilities that Crash has. PS1 Coco plays exactly the same as this version, and the thing that lets you switch characters in the Warp Room, if you bring that into normal levels, you do get some weird results, like become invincible as Crash, switch to Coco, and she retains the invincibility even though she doesn't have the mask for it. And did you know that the Crash and Coco you see in this map level are also imposters? That's a bit scary actually. But yes, unless you choose to play as Coco, then the only time you'll see her is in levels like this, or some of the vehicle levels. The jet ski levels in particular. As I said, that is a different type of vehicle to the others I've talked about so far. The board and the bike are entities that have been added to their levels, like the crates, enemies, everything like that. And you might expect the jet ski to be the same as the bike. You land on it when you spawn in, and you use it for the whole duration of the level. But no, the jet ski and the biplane are something totally different. Neither of those vehicles exist anywhere inside the levels they're used in. They are stored in their own separate archives in the same way that Crash and Coco are. And even though it looks like Crash and Coco each use a different plane in the flying levels, it is always the same one. Coco's is just a skin swap in the same way that her pilot outfit is to her normal look. And so, because these things have their own archives, they are loaded into levels via the zone info stuff, the same as the characters are. I suppose in those levels, you do have full freedom of movement within the boundaries of the level. It's not like the bike, which is confined to following the road and can't turn back on itself. Although, even though the bike is stuck on that predetermined path, it isn't that complicated to get it working in levels where it shouldn't be. The same with the rideable animals, actually. There's no need to manually map out a route for them. You can just point them to follow the path of the camera instead. But the jet ski and the plane do exist entirely separately from the levels they appear in. And while they are both spawned in using the zone info of those levels, there is a slight difference between the two. Unlike in the original Crash 3, you can choose between either Crash or Coco for the plane levels. So because there now isn't a predetermined specified character for those levels, it's only the plane that's mentioned in the zone info because it's essential the plane gets loaded in. Good luck beating those levels from the ground. But the jet ski levels are still locked just to Coco. So those zone info files include both Coco's name and the jet ski. That means it's possible to have two character names listed for a level. Player 2 doesn't have to be a vehicle. I haven't yet found a way to turn this into a proper multiplayer mod though. I don't know if there's any way to control Player 2 independently. Even trying this on the Switch port of the game, where you can set on an OS level, this controller is Player 1 and this controller is Player 2, I think it'd require a whole different kind of modding to get that working. Having said that, if you're ever able to get out of either the jet ski or the plane, you'll realise you're now controlling both the player and the vehicle at the same time, which is confusing. Another thing that shows that these two vehicles in particular are in a category of their own is that if you ever happen to find yourself riding the jet ski through these rings that are normally used in the flying level, Rings of Power, they work in exactly the same way they do in Rings of Power, even giving you this boost, which I don't think you can ever normally do on the jet ski. It works for these secret Skylanders vehicles too that were left in the game, because those are all part of this same class of standalone vehicle. This one I've shown before. It appears to be a prototype version of the Skylanders vehicle known as the Jetstream. There's also a couple of others that only exist in the files of the Microsoft Store version of the PC game. It's something I only found out about very recently. This one looks a lot like the Toon Buggy car from Skylanders Superchargers, part of it anyway. This other one I'm not sure about. I couldn't find anything that resembles it on the Skylanders wiki anyway. But I would assume that the reason why the plane and the jet ski work differently to everything else is because of Skylanders Superchargers, which is the game that introduced vehicles to that series. And just like with all of the playable characters in those games, to use the vehicles, you got to collect their corresponding physical toys, and then you put the toy on the magical thing to load it into the game, exactly the same as you do with the character you want to use. Hence, characters and vehicles being the same thing, basically. So Skylanders has 3 classes of vehicles: land, sea and sky. And if you were going to remake these Crash 3 levels using this game engine, it makes sense that you'd use the sea and sky vehicle functionality you already have as the basis of that, which explains why these vehicles are done differently to everything else. And that is also the reason why the bazooka power-up turns into a homing attack when you use it on the jet ski. It's just doing what those Skylanders vehicles do when you use a weapon, because this is a Skylanders vehicle. The target you see there, the same as the reticle you get when flying the plane. Normally that's the only place it appears in this game. That graphic is directly taken from Skylanders. It may be one of the only hand-me-down resources from those games that you don't need to go digging through the files to find. The PS1 version of this gameplay doesn't include a target like that, so maybe they didn't plan to include one here, but it just was automatically packaged with the Superchargers template vehicle they used to create the plane, and they thought, oh, that's quite helpful actually, and they just left it enabled. Maybe. That might explain why they didn't make a new one anyway. As for the Toon Buggy's inclusion in the files as a land vehicle template, maybe that indicates that they were testing this as a potential way to do the motorbike levels too, but you would have to change a lot about how that gameplay works for it to fit. It would make more sense to start from scratch with that, I think. I'm sure some of this was still recycled for Nitro Fueled later on though, but apart from those specific vehicles, the plane and the jet ski, everything else you ride or drive or fly is an object that lives inside the level where you encounter it. Even though Coco's spaceship sort of seems like a similar kind of thing to the plane, you don't have that full 3D movement with it, so it isn't part of that group. Notice that this one doesn't use the Skylanders reticle. Although, turn the spaceship into a playable character the same way I did with Baby T, and use it as the pilot in the plane levels, yeah, these weapons are much more effective than the machine gun that comes as standard. And remember, the general rule is that if it works with the plane, it works with the jet ski too. That's another useful distinction between standalone vehicles and in-level vehicles. Someone like Baby T can't use the board because a lot of the gameplay logic involved with making that work is within Crash and Coco's code. The bike doesn't even spawn in if you're not playing as Crash or Coco. But Baby T can fly the biplane because it's its own fully fledged thing. Even as an unhatched egg, he can use these vehicles. In that spaceship, when placed into a level as just a thing, you can attack it to slowly damage it, and when you finally kill it, you also die. And if you ever wondered about the upgraded version of this ship, when Purah flies over to dock with you, it's all part of the same model. Whether this extra attachment is visible or not is based entirely on the animations. That's not even the real Purah, he's part of the ship model too. Here's a fun little thing about the plane though, that only gets revealed when you place that into a level. When you get close to it, it displays this Skylanders speech bubble icon. I don't think it actually has anything to say, but it is an extra little hint towards vehicles and characters being the same thing. Of course, killing a plane kills you too. And if you ever manage to use Crash's normal spin attack while you're flying, you can self-destruct. This whole system, where you have the player loading in from one archive, the vehicle loading from another, both separate to the level, that is how Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled does it too. As I said, that is also the same engine as this game. So you can have carts driving carts, carts without drivers, and drivers without carts in that game. Does that mean you can have Crash running around the racetracks on foot, turning them into enormous free-roaming 3D platforming worlds? Possibly, yes. It may well be simpler to go the other way and port those tracks into the Sane Trilogy instead. I will get around to looking into stuff like that more eventually. I mean, it took like 25 years for modding of the original CTR to really get going, alright? I'll get back to you on that stuff in a couple of decades. And if you're wondering, there aren't any of the same kind of NPC characters who can be made playable in Nitro Fueled as there are in the trilogy.
Punch him in the throat.
Any of the characters you see in the backgrounds of the racetracks or anything like that are always the same kind of purely scenery background objects that fake crashes in the NST. The only secret playable characters in that game really are the ghost racers you see in specifically the developer time trials. Because of how the time trial system works, they needed to be added in as unselectable characters independent to the characters they appear to be playing as, for their names to be displayed in-game and for everything to work correctly. But back to this game, you can kind of see it doesn't matter that much whether a vehicle or other kind of mount is classed as its own discrete character or if it's an object within a level. It's still the same type of object when you drill down to it. The exceptions to that are the torpedo firing scuba jet thing from the swimming levels. That's just a standard gameplay object like any other hazard that shoots projectiles, except it attaches to Crash. The torpedoes themselves are part of Crash's character files rather than the level, so this vehicle is just a visual thing. Same with the jetpack, really. There's no jetpack object of any kind. It's just a different control scheme for Crash and an alternate skin, the same as the biker outfit and the scuba gear, in fact. It only ever exists as a separate object during the death animations. When you see Cortex using a jetpack in Crash 2, however, that's a bit different. This is sort of why I can't be that specific about the exact number of potentially playable characters in the Sane Trilogy. The different variations of Cortex are all the same character. They're all named the same, which, as we've seen, is the important part, but they have different accessories depending on which level you take him from. Fun fact about the Crash 1 Cortex boss, though, while we're talking about this, although it gives the impression that the blimp you're standing on is travelling around in a big circle with the castle in the centre, actually what you're standing on is completely stationary, and everything in the background is sort of attached to a non-physical, non-visible entity that is positioned in the centre of everything and is rotating to make all of the scenery linked to it also rotate, which creates this effect. If you change the properties of the scenery to instead fix onto Cortex, it kind of helps you to understand what's going on, and it may also make you vomit, sorry. And actually there is one version of Cortex that isn't the same character as the others. It's strange actually that this Roman Cortex is one of these actor characters, the special kind. You never interact with him at any point. He does celebrate your death, sure, but he does more in his appearances in Crash 1 bonus rounds, flying off with Torna, giving you collectible keys and everything. But in those appearances, he is just an object, fake Crash style. The different versions of someone like Ripperoo, though, or Tiny Tiger, those are all separate characters in their own right. But of course, the question is, how many of these boss characters are interesting if you make them playable? Out of all the characters that are not intended to ever be playable, These have got to be the most complicated in terms of their code and their behavior, their interactions with the player and the environment and the progression of the levels they feature in. So surely they must have the most potential to be interesting, you might think. But a lot of them, I found, you can't do that much with them. Most of them just kind of stand there, stuck at the spawn point. Some of them you can move a little bit, but not properly. Sometimes you can map their attacks to your controller by taking advantage of the cold hard crash body slam trigger. Sometimes you don't need to do that because they start attacking of their own accord. Koala Kong is an odd one because sometimes when the level starts, he will just be perpetually flexing and posing, and he doesn't start his normal attack routine until you press a button. And that's without the body slam thing, he just works like that for some reason. But what about Pinstripe? I did put a clip in a video once that implied I was playing as him to shoot some nitro crates. The disappointing behind-the-scenes story of that is I was just playing as Crash and I was running around above Pinstripe off-screen to change where he was aiming towards. So you are probably going to have to play Crash Boom Bang if you want to play a non-racing game as Pinstripe, I'm afraid. The bosses that seem at first like the best candidates for actually getting you through a level are the ones that have some kind of walking ability already. The monster form of Embryo is a great example of this. After he transforms, he charges towards you a few times as he attacks. And when you make him playable, you can walk around as that monster. And actually, this is a really good one for showing how this differs from a simple model swap. Because a long time ago, I did talk about playing as, in inverted commas, Hulk Embryo, but that again was just Crash made to look like him and using his animations. In that case, you don't get the same camera shake effect that real Embryo produces, and his fists don't break anything they come into contact with, because he still has Crash's crash-sized, pill-shaped hitbox. Properly playing as Embryo, as I am here, lets you use his attack to its full effect. And as I discussed way back in the day, the other boss with a functioning walk animation is Papu Papu. For the whole of the fight against him, he stays in the center of his hut. The only time you see him walking is just before he starts attacking, and you can interact with him at that point and knock him off course a little bit. So that's probably why this is real physical movement rather than just an animation, so that he's always able to get to the center of the hut, no matter how hard you try to stop him from doing that. And so I guess that's why you're able to use that ability as the player too. I haven't found any bosses who will let you jump as well as walk, and that isn't just the same issue that I mentioned with the Skylanders characters. There's no hidden jumping ability that's just been switched off with these guys. So you probably can't get that far in most levels playing as a boss character, unfortunately. But I still think it's really interesting that any of these bosses have the code required to listen to player inputs in the first place. But being able to walk around as characters that do walk around anyway is not the most surprising thing I discovered when I started experimenting with all of this stuff. Let's have a chat, shall we, about the Komodo Brothers, Crash 2, Boss 2. This fight is a little unorthodox because it's 2 against 1. The guy in the middle of the tent is Komodo Mo. The one spinning around all over the place is his brother, Komodo Joe, and they work together to attack you. If you play as Komodo Mo, with no further modding, this is what it looks like. He breaks out of the starting animation, but then he keeps doing this forever. If you play as Joe, he doesn't even get that far. Their home level needs both of them to be present for everything to work as it should. So, okay, it makes sense that in other situations that remains true. And if you do play as Joe while Mo is also there in the level, either from the boss fight's map files or loaded in as player 2, it's the same result either way. That will enable Joe as the player character to start spinning. And when he does, you can move him around however you want. Keyboard or controller or whatever, all the normal directional inputs work. Baby T, fine, he's supposed to be able to move around like this anyway. Embryo, Papu Papu, they have walking animations. I can understand why they might work. But this I don't know why Komodo Joe, of all people, is playable to this extent. Most of the time when bosses move around, they're heading towards specific waypoints, or they're attached to an invisible track of some kind. This guy sort of just bounces around the walls of the tent willy-nilly like a DVD logo. So maybe at some point during development, to help figure out his movement properties, they rigged up an easy way to control him while playing the game, and this is some remnant of that. Maybe it's just the same thing that lets you nudge some of the other bosses around slightly, but with less friction. I don't know, but I find this pretty fascinating. And even though it's fun to have Mo there as well to set him off, there are ways to make him work on his own, just like how I got Baby T out of his egg. Is it weird that there's someone in a Crash Bandicoot game who has a better spin attack than Crash Bandicoot? Another secret thing about Komodo Joe, he has his own health bar. The boss health HUD that you see in the Komodo Brothers fight that's presented as a joint thing is part of Mo's character. It only decreases when he gets hurt. But in the same way that Skylanders Crash had his jumping turned off, Joe had his health bar turned off. I'm not sure if there's any way that it can be depleted though, but he's not the only character with a secret health bar. In both of Engine's boss fights, the health on screen only applies to his mechs. Engine himself, the tiny little guy in the cockpit, if you turn his health back on, you can see why he feels safer being inside those massive, scary machines. And here's one that I think is quite weird. The penguin, who appears at the start and end of the Dingodile fight, not only is in this exclusive club of 80-something characters who can be made playable, but he also has a health bar. I'm not sure if he can get hurt without turning back on some of his other properties that have been disabled, but I have tried doing that out of curiosity to see what happens, and unlike with Papu Papu, while it looks like this guy is running around all over the place, that is all just cutscene animations. His physical location is always in exactly the same spot as Dingodile's is. So I have seen that sometimes when you're attacking Dingodile, or when Dingodile explodes, the penguin can also take a hit. Normally, after you beat Dingodile, the penguin jumps up and down on his corpse in celebration, but if his health is fully drained before then, he never comes back. None of the other penguins in the game have any of this extra character data going on, so maybe this one really is Penta, as suggested by the trophies, or was Penta, I suppose. In terms of other non-boss characters who can technically be made playable, like with the bosses, they're largely not that helpful for getting around levels. Some of them are just less able versions of the bosses. Anytime a giant head chats to you via hologram or through the time vortex, that's a separate character to their other appearances. Not really that surprising that none of these guys have walking animations though, to be fair to them. Then you've got things like your boulders, your gigantic polar bears, your generic dinosaurs. Same restrictions as with the smaller animals though, they're all meant to stick to a defined route, so you can't do that much with them. Other enemies you can try playing as are various types of lab assistants. It's often the ones that themselves appear to use some kind of vehicle. The UFO pilots, the carpet pilots, all pretty inanimate because they also usually have specific paths that they stick to. But unlike something like the different versions of Cortex, where his hoverboard, for example, is a separate object that's sort of glued to him, all of these lab assistants are part of the same models as their vehicles. That might be best demonstrated by model swapping one of these with a different type of lab assistant. I bring this up mostly as an excuse just to mention the one exception I found to this setup. These sort of first mate lab assistants in the jet ski levels with their little rowing boats. The sailor and the boat are two different objects. It's actually the sailor that's moving back and forth, and the boat is a decorative thing that's attached to him. And you can take advantage of that attachment property to stick different enemies to different other things. That can be fun. These wizards are fun too. They're not playable, but they're hats and staffs that get left behind after you kill them that you can push around a bit. This is how I figured out how to change the physics properties of other objects like crates and everything else really. But I already made a whole other video about crates and stuff. I was talking about these guys in the rowing boats. They are the only enemies who are not like fused to their vehicles. So you can't really swap, for example, these fighter pilots with other characters in a satisfying way. If you want to see other people flying planes though, the whole thing about Crash's biplane working in the same way as Crash Team Racing vehicles means that keep the plane as player 2 and you can have anyone you want as player 1 and it will work exactly the same as normal. So sure, the concept of there being 80 whatever playable characters may not amount to that much a lot of the time. And by the way, if you're waiting for a full list of these characters, then again, it's not easy to be precise about it because characters with the same names sometimes have slightly different properties. Sometimes characters have different names but are still actually identical to each other. Every time I try to generate a complete list that takes all of that into account, I get totally different results. So I'll just say, here's a rough estimated list of all these different sort of playable characters. And if that doesn't quite come to 80, then you can just throw in some of the characters who only exist in the Microsoft Store version of the game that I mentioned earlier, because there's even more Skylanders stuff if you look in there. But yeah, even if many of these characters can't really do anything when you play as them like this, here, anyone that's playable is at least as playable as Crash Bandicoot is, and with some of the bosses, you can take advantage of their attacks here in ways that you can't so much in platforming levels. My favourite might be Koala Kong. Those rocks that he normally hurls towards you as the player, he's able to use them as additional firepower against the blimps. Even better when he's on the jet ski and it becomes a homing attack the same way the bazooka does. This is my new preferred way of playing the level Hot Coco, certainly. Based on the targeting thing, he does seem to recognise the jet ski itself as something to attack. Luckily, he doesn't destroy it. No matter which character the player is though, your vehicle is still always vulnerable to the same attacks it normally is, so it can still get killed and leave you marooned in the middle of the ocean. Where's underwater Dingodile when you need him? But yeah, in general, if you're playing as a boss character, you can only really be hurt by something that would hurt them in their boss fight. If you're playing as Ripperoo, stay away from TNTs, and so on. Now, what's your first thought when you learn that A, all the bosses are playable, and B, there are specific hazards that can hurt them that are different depending on who you play as? Because that makes me want to see what happens if you try playing every boss fight as every boss character. This is my version of Crash Team Rumble. Given that there's 16 boss levels across the 3 games, a complete tournament of everyone versus everyone would be too much to cover right now, but please let me know if that's something you do want to see. There are a few fights that I've tried that I think are interesting. When you fight Papu Papu as Koala Kong, you'll fall out of the world a few times, but still manage to do some damage to him. Try to fight Ripperoo as Koala Kong though, and he can hurt you. Kong versus Kong is a stalemate, unsurprisingly. Kong totally wrecks Dingodile though.
Break out the butter.
Even though his health never seems to go down, he never recovers from that first hit. Koala Kong against Embryo is pretty great. Kong easily squashes the blobs you need to kill to knock down human Embryo's health, but once he transforms into Hulk Brio, he beats the shit out of you. The scientists are Koala Kong's weakness apparently, because Cortex can beat him too. Roman Tiny defeats Space Tiny without even doing anything if you just wait around long enough for the right platforms to fall. But my favourite, once again, is probably Komodo Joe. His spin attack works on anyone who is hurt by Crash's spin attack, so he might be the only boss character who you can use to actively fight other bosses, rather than just like spawning them in and spectating. Actually, it is the same for Embryo. He may well be the only one of these who can complete some of the normal platforming levels, in fact. He's not going to be fast, but there definitely are some you can get through without jumping. But yeah, okay, with almost all of these not supposed to be playable but kind of are anyway characters, you can probably only really consider them to be actually playable if you put them into vehicles. And sometimes it can work pretty well if you do something like have certain characters flying a plane but with the plane hidden. This gives a pretty good impression of playing as Cortex on his hoverboard, right? It's close. Because yeah, these characters driving or piloting vehicles is exactly the same as how Skylanders Superchargers and CTR Nitro Fueled work. But if you did want to bring someone like Ripperoo into this game, you may have to go down the model swapping route to make it work. Because even though it is all the same engine and the same sort of file formats, the minor version and platform differences are enough to prevent characters from different Alchemy games being 100% cross-compatible with each other. Converting character models between different games is still something I only got far enough with just to confirm it was possible. Everything else you'd need to do to get Rillaru or someone else from CTR into the Sane Trilogy as a completely functional playable character would require a lot more work. Unless there's anyone who fits perfectly with Crash's animation files, it isn't really going to happen anytime soon. This Mina mod I've shown a few times as like a proof of concept uses the animations from Skylanders Crash instead of normal Crash because their statures are more similar. That's the same as what I did for my old Cortex mod, so many of Skylanders Crash's issues still apply to these guys too. I have experimented with the possibility of using the animation files from some of those millions of Skylanders characters to get CTR racers working better than the Sane Trilogy. Surely you can do something like have Rillaru using Donkey Kong's animation rig to get him platforming, but oh, that's not good. What about Spyro's CTR model with Spyro's Skylanders animations? Yeah, you'd have to get into modifying skeletons and everything to make anything like this work well, and it's a whole other separate branch of modding that's not even related to Alchemy. That's all done through Havoc instead. So it is always going to be only characters who already exist in the Sane Trilogy who can be made playable just through dragging and dropping their files into the right locations. Obviously, there's always a lot further you could go with more advanced modding and rewriting of how everything works. But what I wanted to focus on here really was, here's some things the game is ready to do out of the box by just moving a couple of files around, changing some text here and there, stuff like that, because I think that's a lot more interesting and more easy. So, alas, crunch using the bazooka may remain as something that can only be fully realised in other games. For now. Maybe that's for the best.
How about a hard one next time?
Talking about Spyro and Skylanders and all of that though, I hadn't really considered before how sort of symbiotic and cyclical the relationship between Crash and Spyro has been in this reboot era. The Skylanders franchise did start out with and spin off from Spyro. Then those games became the foundation of the Crash remakes. Love it or hate it, the Sane Trilogy was successful. Without Skylanders, it would have been made differently and may not have sold as well, but it was enough of a hit that Spyro was given the chance to come back too. I think that's kind of beautiful. They helped to revive each other, and it all worked out in the end, and all of the series I've talked about and all of these wonderful characters are still all thriving to this day, right?
Bandicoot.